So I met both of you through a mutual friend, but I've seen you guys all over the place. I know you've spoken up at the State House with MFI, and then you've also spoken at one of our recent events that we had, I believe back in August. We have so many of them. I believe you guys are at the August one, right? That
I
was
think it
yeah,
was
it was
August
August.
or
So
September. Yeah.
yeah, so we got to hear a little bit more of your stories, and I think that these types of stories and perspectives are very important for us to kind of get out there because our schools right now, that's the most important kind of elections that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of funding for our school committee candidates, and you've both had experiences, in the school system that have seemed to be, they could have been a lot better. Do you want to kind of, I guess, start from the beginning of where you kind of saw those issues with the school system and what they were kind of pushing onto you, and kind of how when you grew up you kind of saw how those thoughts and opinions that you were giving or were being given were from an incorrect place. Where did it start for you both?
So for me, it started in the 8th grade whenever I moved from a more conservative district to a more liberal district in Texas. And I was already indoctrinated into it at this point. This was very shortly before I started taking testosterone. But in my 8th grade sex ed class, I was shown the genderbread person, which is a infographic designed to indoctrinate children into trans ideology. And I think Simon was shown a similar.
Yeah, gender unicorn, ninth grade.
Mm-hmm.
The gender unicorn.
Yes.
So that I've personally never had anything like that happen. I grew up in a very red area of Massachusetts, one of the very historic and smaller pockets of Mass that has kind of always voted red. So I think I kind of got a more laxed version of something like that. I personally didn't see anything wrong with my sex ed course, but again, back then I wasn't really looking at that. And I think it's important that you both have had very different experiences. America is a huge place, so we're not going to have the same sex ed experience or the same teachers. So for you, how was like your teachers? Were they just kind of all very, very far left and extreme in that regard? And how did what they taught, like, teach you with the models that your districts have? How would you say that kind of negatively affected your experiences? Like, how did that chart really kind of, I guess if confusion is the right word to use, how do you think charts like the gingerbread and the unicorn, how can that really confuse kids? Like, why is it harmful?
So my sex ed course, we actually had an outside group come in and do the sex ed. It wasn't teachers from my school. I'm not sure what the group was. I don't remember. But whenever you're a child and adults that you trust are telling you that this is true, you believe it. Children, like even 13, 14-year-old 8th graders, they're still children, and they still trust the adults around them to be giving them accurate information.
Yeah, I think, obviously for me, this was the first time that, I had heard from my classmates and on the internet all of these kind of ideas about non-binary and transgender and pansexual, and I was all kind of confused by it.
Yeah.
There was kind of this implicit assumption on my part that all of these terms were real and legitimate, or else why would people be using them, right? So when in my sex ed class, I was presented with the gender unicorn. And for those of you who are not aware, it basically presents gender identity, gender expression, sex, sexual orientation, romantic orientation, all these different things as like separate kind of spectrums or options. So there's this implication that you can be some third sex, or that you could be anywhere on kind of a spectrum of gender identity, which is irrespective of gender expression and all this sort of thing. And so I looked at this and I said, well, I'm obviously not quite like the other boys, so I must be somewhere on this kind of ambiguous spectrum. And on the spectrum, they draw these arbitrary lines of this is man, this is woman, this is neither. And I was, I looked around and I'm like, well, I must solidly be in the neither category here. So it's definitely othering. It encourages kids who are weird and nerdy, which is exactly the kids who are targeted by transgender ideology, to be feel separate from other members of their sex.
Yeah, I think, and just to kind of a question on top of that is, you mentioned I don't know if it was a spectrum, but you mentioned the how they kind of draw lines. Now, the three of us know that there's a male and a female, and there's nothing else in between. That's just facts. That's how God intended it. That's just what's there. No, when you say they draw like a line, what type of lines would they draw when it comes to, or not like a physical line, but what would they kind of come up with? And is it just kind of like the whole delusion of there being 36 different genders, and just kind of like the pronouns and stuff like that? Like, what would you say was kind of brought up a lot that kind of like clicked, that where you were like, maybe I'm this? Like, what was that for you?
Well, first of all, you're showing your age. 36 genders, we have at least 180 now.
Yeah.
But it honestly, it boils down to stereotypes, and I think Claire can definitely speak to that.
When we're talking about like actual physical sex, I was told that sex is kind of arbitrarily assigned based on the length of the erectile tissue, like the clitoris or penis, that below a certain size is considered female and above a certain size is considered male. I don't remember if that was what I was told in my sex ed course, if I saw that online, but that's what I recall. But yeah, the whole gender identity thing, it was pretty explicitly said that, well, if you are assigned this, but you prefer the toys or playmates of the opposite sex, that means you might be something else. You might actually secretly, in your soul, be the opposite sex.
Yeah, so, there's a lot of debate going on of, I think one of the bigger books is, there's a lot of books out there that kind of go over this with children. A lot of them are in libraries. I believe one of them is Not All Boys Wear Blue, Are Blue. And those have kind of been the talking point at school board meetings. Very frustrated parents. Where would you say you would draw the line between what should be discussed in school with children and what should be left at home for the parents?
I think that children should know the correct terms for their body parts and should be taught about consent and it being important and what is wrong for an adult to do to a child. But I don't think that anything about sexuality or gender identity or anything like that needs to be taught in school. I think that that's something that children will learn about themselves eventually naturally, or will be discussed with by their parents.
Okay.
Yeah. And I agree with what Claire just said, and I want to emphasize that sex ed can be taught in a way that isn't, at all pornographic in nature. You can talk about gametes. You can say, these are the zones on your body which is not okay for somebody to touch without your consent. Things like this, and that can be age appropriate for all ages, right? What isn't age appropriate is these books we see which depict a specific sex acts. That's not cool. What's not okay is when we see these books which promote transgender ideology. On the kind of sexuality piece, I think that schools should take a very neutral stance. on sexuality. I think that should be between the parents and the child and the local community, or the church or the synagogue or whatever the case may be. And just say, here's how once you're in high school, obviously, here is how you prevent STDs. This is how fertility works. And then, I think that's really all you need to know. And understanding that if a man were to engage with another man, that there's no risk of pregnancy, obviously, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of confusion, especially with those younger kids. You tell them, this or that, and they'll just believe it instantly. And I think there's a lot of manipulation going on right now within our school system. So, just a quick rebuttal to what you were saying. What do you think the appropriate grade would be to have a sex ed course? I know for my sex ed course personally was around 7th or 8th grade. Do you think maybe that should be a little bit higher, or do you think maybe that's like right around the right age where puberty is starting to happen? What would your thoughts be on that?
I think that accurate terminology is necessary for kids to know, like, as young as kindergarten. And I was taught in kindergarten about the no-no square, that there are different regions on your bodies that adults should never touch outside of, like, medical contexts. And I think that is appropriate. I think that when it comes to, like, pregnancy prevention and STDs, stuff regarding, like,
Intercourse.
Intercourse, yes. I think that, like, 7th, 8th
I could
grade
probably wait a little bit.
Yeah.
I would say even like 9th grade. I mean,
Yeah.
Look, the kind of kids who are going to have sex in middle school are very rare. I think it might be different from community to community and school to school. I mean, look, if your local community has that kind of problem, yeah, teach it earlier. If it doesn't, you don't need to teach that early.
So it sounds like it's kind of like a case-by-case basis depending on the school. I would definitely say that because, something that Massachusetts is going to put into place is going to be very different than we see in Texas or like a Florida or, Washington, D.C. I think what we're really seeing right now, there's a lot of individualism where everyone wants to be special. They want to put themselves kind of in a different bracket than somebody else, which, I don't think we should encourage putting people into boxes. There are a lot of things that are very different. But when it comes to the basics of sex and gender, I think it's definitely appropriate that we kind of draw the line between what is okay and what isn't, and the ages that these discussions should be had. Back to one of your points you said is that I definitely think this should be discussed with the parents at home. I guess it really depends on if you take a more like libertarian approach to it, where you think it should just be at home and, parents should be, if we think that all parents are responsible in teaching that, or if we should take more of a authoritarian stance where it should just be, the school is going to teach it. I think there's also a lot of nuance in some of these issues because sometimes parents may not teach those things. So I think there's always going to be gaps in what is actually being taught to children, but I think, at the school level, there should be at least a bare minimum basic, requirement with some, just logic of, the differences and stuff. And I think some questions that, because they're going to ask questions. I know for me, I grew up in East Bridgewater, Mass. So like I said, very red area. I remember my sex ed class being with our gym teacher. So the gym teacher kind of had that curriculum. I don't know their specific background or tenure in that, but that's just how it was for me. And then, they went over the charts. The girls sat on one. It was a combined class, so the girls were on one side, the men were on one side, and they just kind of showed everything, and then they said questions. And then, people started asking questions, and just your typical is kind of awkward. It's school. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it's something that's required. Now, I know both of you have had experiences personally. Simon, just so I get the terms correctly, you're a desister, and Claire, you would say you're a detransitioner, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Could you kind of define the differences for the audience. I know we spoke about it, or you spoke about it at our event, but I think a lot of these terms are like personally, I had never heard the term desister before, and I think for a lot of people that may be a new term. Could you kind of define the difference between the two?
Absolutely. But first, I do want to circle back on the kind of approaches to teaching sex ed or to not teach sex ed. I think you draw out a little bit of a false dichotomy between teaching it or not teaching it. The solution I personally support is I think that parents should be fully aware of what their kids are learning in school. When it comes to
100%.
sex ed and related topics, I do think that they should have the option to opt out. Um, we've seen a lot of fights over this, and
Yes.
that way, if you have a parent who's kind of negligent about those things, the parent's probably not going to be aware enough to even opt out in the first place. And then if you have a parent who's kind of conscientious about those things, they might opt out or they might not opt out. Either way, it's fine for the kid. That's my point on that.
Yeah.
Then desisters versus detransitioners. So generally, I call myself a desister because I desisted from what I believe to be a cult. There were actions I took as part of that process. I socially transitioned. I changed my name. I changed my pronouns. I changed how I lived my life in quite significant ways. But I did not medically transition. And I think it's very useful to have two different terms to differentiate those who were in it but did not medically transition from those who did medically transition, because that's a whole different set of problems, which I'm never really going to understand. So Claire is a detransitioner, which means that basically a very similar situation, but did end up medically transitioning. And that can include anything from cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, to surgeries.
Awesome. Thank you for defining the terms. I think that's very important to understand because even now, I think I'm starting to really try to learn about these types of issues because I've it's never really been prevalent in my life. But when I heard your stories, I was like, this is a big thing going on. I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't really know the full details and how it really affected people. I think it's important to have people hear your stories because if you don't have kids or you haven't yet had kids, it's good to know before you get into the school system what types of challenges that parents may face when putting their kids in certain or having your kids teach and learn these types of classes. One thing I want to go back on real quick is that you did mention the like the opting in and out. I think that's perfect. Now, do you think it should be a like we're opting in, or should it just be by default they're already into it and they have to be taken out? I've personally heard from a lot of parents who very busy lives that it may be better for parents to opt into sex ed than to opt out. What would your perspective be on that?
I think that when it comes to sexual education courses involving like intercourse and whatnot, that should be something that is opted into. I
Okay.
don't think that what I was talking about accurate terminology regarding the body and consent and whatnot. I don't think that that's something that parents should be able to opt out of, seeing as how the majority of sexual abuse is committed by people in the home.
Yeah, I'm going to back up Claire there, and the kind of sex ed that I think we're both advocating for does not include specific descriptions of intercourse because that's just not necessary. Kids find a way, and
Yeah.
they're already exposed to it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think even the internet too should maybe have some restrictions in place for our younger audiences so they don't go down the wrong paths with those things.
That's an implementation problem.
Yeah, it's definitely that, and I think part of it could maybe even be like a parental issue where I personally don't think we should give our kids free reign on the internet. I think it is a very prevalent thing, but I think it's a combination between parenting as well and making sure that you're watching what your kids are consuming, just to make sure they don't go down any bad paths with that. So I would definitely agree with that, and I think what you're proposing is a great common sense approach. I know you guys advocated for a bill with was it State Rep Gasky at one point? I
Yes.
know I heard about that. Do you want to just kind of go into um, I guess why you support that bill and why you think it will help? I did look it over a while back, and from when I read it before, it did seem like a really solid bill. I think it gives a nice, good, common sense approach to this issue. Can you just kind of explain like your involvement and how you helped with that process?
Absolutely. So, not a lot of people know this, but so we're talking about Bill H 1172.
Yeah,
It's been filed this section. We had a hearing a couple of weeks ago. We had what I think it was 19 people testify in favor and one
that's
person
awesome.
testify against. Astonishing. We now have a companion Senate bill filed by Senator, I believe it's Senator Fatman. Now, I think one of the uh, stories that needs to be told about this bill is that even though it's filed by Republicans on both sides of the legislature here in Massachusetts, it's been a significant bipartisan effort. I know the guy who wrote it. I'm not at liberty to share who that is, but he's a Democrat. Has been his whole life, and he wrote
Yeah.
it because he believes in the issue. We had many people who testified, who got up there and said, "I'm a Democrat, I'm a lesbian, I'm a feminist." All of these different sorts of people, and of course, people on the right, really uniting behind this bill. What the bill does is here in Massachusetts, right? Due to a combination of a legislative framework, the Constitution, and directives from our favorite Maura Healey, it is basically mandated that both public and private insurance companies cover medical transition, both for adults and for minors. Those who go through that medical pathway and choose to reverse it are left out to dry because what is not covered under this framework is detransition. This bill is an attempt to remedy that, and just to say that, hey, look, you got to cover detransition. Now, the way we look at it is if the people on kind of the other side of this issue, the trans radical activists, think that detransition is very rare, well, this bill, won't do any harm. And even if detransition was common, well, it would do a lot of good. And I think it's a real no-brainer, but there are still some people who are out there who have fought it, and a lot of Democrats don't want to talk about it. And, me and Claire and, some people from DIAG and LGBT Courage Coalition and some other organizations have been making our rounds around the State House trying to talk to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle about this. And we've got a lot of really positive reception from the Republicans and not a lot of positive reception from the Democrats, which saddens me greatly.
Yeah, it's really good to hear that there's bipartisan bills with the bill that was presented. I used to work with the Gasky team a while back. I don't anymore. It was an internship, so after the summer, that kind of stopped. So I did see a couple of those bills. One of the ones that I personally was there for. I wasn't there for your guys' hearing. I did hear it went very well. The one I was there for was the MFI bill for. I don't know if Michael King wrote it specifically, but I think it was kind of a combination between the Gasky team and a couple other Republican state reps and Michael King from MFI, which is the No Men in Women's Sports. Now, the left likes to argue that these are, like transphobic bills and, that they're like violating rights and stuff like that. But the bill, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you'd be a lot better educated on this topic than I am, but it's, from what I've read with the bill, it's not so much kicking people out, but it's more if there is somebody of the opposite sex playing on the team that they can pull out of the game without any repercussions from the coach and the players on the team.
That's exactly what it does, and that's what I
Yeah.
told the lawmakers when I testified in favor of it in the State House. Unfortunately, the committee, I'm not recalling the name of the committee, but I do remember some faces. But the chair of the committee acted in a very disrespectful manner towards Representative Gasky, and at the end of the hearing actually said out loud to the whole room, there's no way we're going to pass some transphobic trash like this. Now, whether or not that got picked up in the hearing recording, feel free to comb through the recordings for me. But look, I think it's quite frankly ridiculous that you can look female athletes who competed against boys and are telling you they need protection, and then saying no. I think that's a really heartless and unempathetic thing to do. And their argument was basically, well, if all the girls opt out, then that's, exclusion of transgender athletes. They shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I've seen a lot of the arguments for it, and I don't really understand why they keep pushing the issue, because nowhere in the bill is it specifically saying like, oh, like they're not specifically allowed to play. All it does is letting them opt out, because there have been countless accounts of injury to women who have played in these sports. I've heard of broken ribs, legs, the in these, like, come on, it's common sense. It's they're stronger, and it's biologically backed that men are stronger than women, and when you put them up, you're giving that unfair advantage. So I hopefully we can get more progression in the state. I do want to kind of give a little I know I ask a lot of questions, but I kind of want to give it to you guys. What would you say? What are you working on next? What is next for Simon and Claire in the the fight for common sense LGBT plus transgender issues? Like, what are you guys working on right now?
We both work with the LGBT Courage Coalition. I'm an IWF ambassador as well, and I think in both nonprofits cases, the next step, so to speak, is working in blue states to get these regulations passed. We've basically already won all the red states, so that's
awesome.
sort of where we are now. I would like to circle back briefly to talking about the insurance bill, because I think my experience is a good representative case of why it's an important bill. I was able to get breast reconstruction covered by my insurance in the state of Maryland, because they have a similar regulation for state-funded insurance that if they cover a medical transition, they have to cover the detransition. And my breast reconstruction is one of the best things I've ever done for myself. It will never give me back what I lost as a child, but whenever I look in the mirror, I'm not reminded of the worst thing that's ever happened to me. So it's very important to me that this is something that's passed.
Yeah, and I think what you guys are both doing is very honorable, and I think I thank you for sharing your experience. It's not hard. It's very hard to kind of let that be out there to the public and kind of go through your experience. It's very personal for people. I assume it must be very hard to to go through something like that, and I don't think I could. I can't have that experience, but it seems like you've prevailed. What would you say to somebody, whether it be a teenager or an adult, or really anyone who may consider like transitioning? And then to also, as like a second question to that, do you think that health insurance should cover transitioning in the first place?
I don't think that health insurance should cover medical malpractice.
Okay, that's a good way of putting that.
I think it's cosmetic surgery, and I don't think that medical insurance should cover cosmetic surgery. But to answer your first question, I would say that you're born perfect, you were made perfectly, and that there is nothing wrong with your body as it is, and you don't need to reject your... I'm stealing a quote from Simon You don't need to reject yourself on a cellular level. That's not how you accept yourself.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I love it when people quote me to me, as happens occasionally now. But I think I might have some insight into this. So one of the things I do, kind of out of the public eye, is I do some coaching. So I'll talk to families with kids who are trans-identified and sometimes the kids themselves. And so I actually have an opportunity to, say something to a kid who's been on estrogen for 3 years or who's thinking about it and all these different points. And a lot of it, honestly, this is going to be a little bit of a lame answer, but a lot of these kids, they just haven't had somebody who will really listen and understand what they're going through.
Yeah.
I had a kid a week or two ago who called me up and said, Simon, I don't think I actually want to be a woman. I just think that, I've been projecting all of my misandry onto myself. And I've wanted to escape all of these expectations, which have been, built up over my life by, my dad and the school system and et cetera, et cetera. And, I said, I'm happy to hear you realize that. And I think that's a big part of it for a lot of the guys, and conversely for a lot of the girls.
I do want to just commend you for your answer about medical malpractice. I think it's very unfortunate that doctors are taking advantage of, patients for profit. I really think it is profit over patients. I probably shouldn't talk
Billions
to...
of dollars in this
Oh,
country
it's...
alone.
I have to be careful what I say, but I do actually, I work in the industry. I'm not a medical professional, but I do work in some of the realms we've spoken about. They're making tens of thousands of dollars per service or per procedure. They get these special contracts, which that's not like private information. That's just out there that specific doctors and surgeons who do these types of procedures, they're getting special contracts from the big insurance companies, and they are being subsidized by certain governments to, perform these services. I definitely think we should cover, the detransitioning. I think that's very noble, but like you said, if we can just somehow, make it so they don't cover it, I think it will definitely deter people. What type of what would you say, maybe helped you? Was it like a social media that kind of, let you know what the thoughts and feelings that you were having were, not completely accurate? Would you say like therapy worked? What would you say, would be like the best course of action for somebody struggling with gender dysphoria?
Do you want to?
It's a great question.
Okay. It is a good question. Do you want to go first, Claire, or do you want
Sure.
me to go first? Okay.
So I was actually just writing about this the other day. For me, what happened was, what got me into trans ideation in the first place was negative experiences I had with men, very young.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of internalized this belief that to be a woman is to be vulnerable and to be predated on, and that to be a man was to be a predator. And I decided that I would rather be the predator. And I think that for a lot of women, I can't speak to the male experience, obviously, but for a lot of women with cross-sex ideation, that this is the case, that there's internalized misogyny and misandry. It's a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a big part of unraveling the ideation is addressing and mitigating these beliefs.
Would you say a lot of that starts at the school level?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So one of the things that whenever I talk to somebody new, in my coaching practice, the first thing I ask about is what I call the wellness checklist. And that's, I ask, how are you sleeping? You actually, process emotions in your sleep. A lot of people don't know this, but that
I know that because dreams, like if I'm thinking about something or really stressing about it, I'm dreaming about it. So I
yes.
100% am on board with that. Yeah,
I asked about the
it's a great
sleep.
point.
So is it regular? Are you sleeping enough? How are you eating? Are you eating enough protein? Are you getting all the nutrients you need? Are you exercising and going outside regularly? Do you have friends? How are your relationships? Right? Do you have a job or school or something? And a lot of the time, if you really get those main things sort of sorted out and kind of
Yeah,
pull the thread, if you know what I mean, a lot of the distress around the body subsides because the patient, let's say, the patient is no longer focused on the body, because part of gender dysphoria is an obsession with your body, with your voice, with the way you act, very inwardly focused. And so everything you can do to get them focused on less about what their body looks like, but what their body can do, and more
yeah,
about what they can do in the real world and the people in their life and the projects. That can be really positive. And then from there, um, that's the biggest chunk of it, to be honest. And then from there, go on an adventure. Like, if go to like a third world country, or go to Texas or something. Go hiking on the Appalachian Trail. All of these different sorts of experiences and opportunities to go on an adventure, whatever that might
yeah,
be, I think are really positive for the process of maturation and individuation, where the adventure doesn't care if you're trans. Like,
yeah,
if you fall down and scrape your knee when you're hiking in the mountains, you're not going to be like, well, that was a transphobic rock,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
So it grounds you in something real, and it gets you off the internet. And then a lot of these kids are autistic, and
mm,
and specifically rather high functioning autistic, at least the ones I work with, because I attract a specific clientele. um, and the thing about high functioning autism is these are the kind of autistic kids and young adults who you'll meet, and they'll tell you, oh, I'm autistic, and you'll be like, oh, I couldn't tell, you don't look autistic, right?
yeah,
But even though that's the case, that doesn't mean that it isn't severe and pervasive. And what that looks like is a lot of difficulties with building relationships, maintaining relationships, understanding emotions of yourself and others. And there's just simple strategies you can teach to these kids and encourage them to go out and practice, that will help them a lot be better
yeah.
people and have more rich and fulfilling lives. And if you have a rich and fulfilling life, you don't need to look somewhere else for that same fulfillment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of research around autism has changed a lot drastically in like the last 20, 30 years. Um, before where there were, putting kids in mental hospitals because they may have like very slight differences, where now it's like, no, like we don't need that. Like that's like, you know what I mean? We've found ways to help people kind of navigate the world and get through their, whether it be social challenges, whether it be talking and, personal stuff like that. Um, medication. I don't, I think everyone has their own take on medication. Some people like it. Some people are just like, I don't want to touch it. Or, like for me personally, I hate medication. I'm not a consistent medication taker. So I've kind of just like, not really, I've never really been in that faction of taking medication, but um, I think that's very important to kind of talk about. Would you say medication, like what would you say like your strategy for somebody, um, you know, who is dealing with these thoughts of gender dysphoria with autism? Would you say that's a lot of you said you kind of like that's your the people you work with and talk to? would you say that's always, the case most of the times, or, is it like, do you think the two are completely correlated, or?
Yeah, so in the population I work with, they're all autistic.
Oh.
They're all autistic. I would, Claire, what percentage of trans-identified kids are autistic, do you think?
I don't know what percentage of trans-identified kids are autistic, but I know that autistic people are about 88 times as likely as non-autistics to identify as trans.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, there was another statistic I heard that Gen Z is the gayest generation. I've heard a lot of that. It sounds like to me, based on our conversation that we've had, that it kind of correlates with the what's been being pushed into schools. Would you tend to agree that that's kind of why?
Okay. This is a really interesting one, and it's complicated and nuanced. And the left is like, oh my God, we're being much more accepting. That means all the gay people who would be in the closet are no. And then people on the right are like, they're making the kids gay with the chemicals in the water. Neither of those are true or based in reality.
Yeah.
What actually is happening is much more complicated. And kind of a little bit of both, to be honest.
Okay.
So if you look at the rates of kind of identifying with particular sexual orientations, when we say gay, we can mean one of two different things, or one of like three different things. So, gay has a strict definition, which is men who are exclusively attracted to other men for romantic and sexual reasons, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's gay, which includes gay men and gay women, right? Women who like women exclusively for romantic and sexual reasons. Mm-hmm. And then there's gay as in somebody who experiences or who claims to experience any kind of same-sex attraction whatsoever. That is a much, much bigger category than either of the two first categories. Yeah. And because there's been an incentive structure created with kind of I like to call the oppression Olympics, you can kind of identify into, bisexuality or any of these kind of made-up sexualities like demisexuality and pansexuality and allosexuality and all of this made-up, bumblygook. And then that oftentimes is labeled as under that big gay umbrella, when in reality, that's not at all what that is. So that's the biggest thing. I think the second effect is when you have, 3% of a generation identifying as transgender, if you have a straight boy and he transitions to become a woman, that's a lesbian woman. And vice versa. Which is actually more common, and so there's a little bit of a conversion therapy, the angle there, which we can get into if you want.
Yeah. I think at this point, if you want to go into that, I think that may be interesting for the audience to understand. Mm-hmm. I think for me personally, I'm definitely not the prodigy on this issue. I've definitely looked into it a little bit, but I think whatever the point of this is to anything you kind of think the public should know about, especially, I'm on the conservative wing, so whatever you think the conservatives, may need to hear or, could be educated on to, either push back at a school committee meeting or, maybe, correct something that has been taught to their kid. I think that's very important. So if there's anything that you think should be out there, I'm all ears, so I think that'd be a good thing to get into.
I have something to say on the matter.
Yep.
So the original cohort of people who were seeking transition were overwhelmingly male. The majority were older heterosexual men, and the minority were young effeminate boys. And that cohort, the younger group, were overwhelmingly grew up to be gay. It was like 80+% grew up to be gay. And this is a trend that we saw continue through the generations until mine and Simon's generation, which the genders flipped. It became overwhelmingly young girls, teenage girls, and something like it was, again, a large percentage. The majority were same-sex attracted to a degree, and I think that. So I'm not a lesbian, but our colleague Jamie Reed, she's discussed at length the fact that so many of these girls who are doing this are autistic or traumatized or in long and short of it, susceptible to social contagion. But when you take that group out, when you take the autistics and the mentally ill out, you are left with gay children who will grow up to be gay. And we are chemically castrating them and destroying their sexual function, their sexuality, and rendering them something else.
Which is non-reversible, correct?
Yes.
It is partially reversible in certain circumstances, but if the full protocol is followed as kind of laid out
That's
by
how it's supposed to be done.
and all of the medical organizations, it does end in permanent and irreversible castration.
Yeah, that. And now one thing we hear about, not to kind of go off topic a bit, I'll try to stay on topic. One thing we hear about abortion is that once it's done, it's irreversible. And a lot of the arguments are that women aren't given the full understanding of what that process is like. Would you say the transitioning, not education, but like if somebody's going to go transition or they're going to go from, male to female, would you say the cause and effect of that is explained? Are there safety nets in place to kind of explain that to people to know, like, this is not, you're not getting back what you had before?
No. There are currently, let me just put it this way. About a year from now, you're going to see a number of fraud cases litigated about that, answering that specific question.
What do you mean fraud cases? Are you talking insurance fraud, legal fraud?
All of the above.
You think all of it, and you think that's going to be more prevalent with...
Yeah.
Would you say that would affect our generation?
Consumer fraud as well.
Consumer fraud. Yeah, I know, personally working in the industry, what are the biggest, cause and effect when it comes to the rising cost of healthcare? That's a big one that we're seeing, especially right now, is fraud. Fraud is a very big factor into why the cost of health insurance goes up every year. Again, I work on the front lines of fraud and the processing from start to finish, from when a patient goes and sees a provider to the very end when the patient's being billed, a couple weeks later. So, how do you think these, these cases, whether it be in court, whether it be, for an insurance company or a provider, what type of effects do you think that's really going to have on, the healthcare system and the legal system?
Malpractice premiums in this area are already skyrocketing, and they have been for years, is what I'll say on the matter.
Yes, correct. I think that I want to give a shout out to Ken Paxton down in Texas, the Attorney General of Texas. I think he's been a little bit slow in the past to prosecute medical malpractice cases, but with this issue specifically, I think he's starting to kind of get going and wake up. I think he was actually in Claire's DMs, if I recall correctly. And so I think that the gender issue, I mean, for me personally, has been a little bit of a gateway issue to understanding a lot of the other problems with healthcare. Where, there is a lot of fraud, and it's not just in this particular area. And that's a big driving reason, as you said, why insurance premiums are so high, why healthcare costs are so high, and then you have this compounding problem of the government's messing with the market in such a way that kind of the the signals and incentives are a bit perverse, such that you're getting a worse service for higher expense.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the, when it comes to the higher costs, like we went over, the waste and abuse that happens. I know we see a lot of double dipping in the cookie jar when it comes to billing for double services. That's something that typically insurance companies deny a lot of is double dipping, and we have a lot of these cases where providers are being arrested even for committing insurance fraud, where all of their claims are now being audited and looked at, and for we got this fraud, we got that, this never actually happened. If you want to get into it, or if you want to stay on topic with the transgenderism issue, I know we spoke about at the event some of the procedure that you went through, Claire. Is that something you feel comfortable, going in depth about, or do you think could be out there for people to kind of just understand a little bit better when it comes to the, logistics of that?
Sure. So my procedures were not covered by insurance. So it's not a matter of insurance fraud or anything of that matter.
It's consumer.
But consumer fraud, in my case. But so yeah, shout out again to Ken Paxton. He is suing the pants off of the endocrinologist who transitioned me when I was in the 8th grade.
She recently surrendered her license to practice in Texas, and then moved
She
to
has
Oregon.
surrendered her Texas medical license. She's
Awesome.
trying to move to Oregon.
Oh, trying.
But I mean,
Okay.
she's attempting to move to Oregon. But like any parent who looks her name up is gonna see that she surrendered her Texas medical license after being sued for I think it's 21 counts of consumer fraud.
Wow.
And it's not looking good for any of the guys. It's looking real bad.
Yeah. Another thing, if you want to touch on it, if not, totally fine. At our event, you kind of went through the construction and deconstruction process. Do you think that's something that you could touch base on a little bit, just for people who weren't at our event?
Sure. Yeah. So whenever I was, you're asking about the process of medical transition that I went through.
Yes, and I guess more specifically, yeah, like the maybe the permanent effects that can have on men and women.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. So when I was in the 8th grade, actually, it started when I was in the 7th grade, and they put me on menstrual suppression medication because I was uncomfortable having a period. Who would think? What girl has been uncomfortable having a period before?
Who's excited for that? So
Right. But so they put me on menstrual suppression medication in the 7th grade when I was 12 years old, and then I might have actually been 13. But when I was 14, they put me on testosterone, which the obvious effect being my voice. I also, which is irreversible. There's a surgery that can be done that will eliminate my lower range of speaking, but it doesn't actually undo the damage that was done to my voice. I also have to shave my face every day. There's reproductive damage that was done, not clear on fertility, but my periods are much more painful now because my reproductive anatomy has been atrophied. There's visible medical injury, we'll say. Testosterone causes enlargement to the clitoris. It's painful and very sensitive and gross. But the summer between 8th and 9th grade, my breasts were amputated, which causes permanent nerve damage I've had to deal with, and I've lost any sort of sensation in my chest. I've also lost the ability to breastfeed permanently. And as I mentioned, I've since had breast reconstruction. I had implants put in around 3 years ago, which I'm very happy with. But I was not. The funny thing is, I was able to have my breasts amputated at 14. But when I was 17 and started looking into breast reconstruction, I was told that I would need to wait until I was 18. That breast implants, I couldn't consent to it. That it was too risky.
Let me get this straight. So at 14, you're allowed to have them removed, but to have them reconstructed, you have to wait till 18.
18 for saline implants, 21 for silicone implants. Yes.
So it seems like the system is kind of backwards there in a way. I don't think somebody who's 14 should be having a procedure like that, but it kind of seems like they're quick to permanently alter children's bodies, and when they realize that this was harmful or that it's having a negative effect, it's kind of like they're forcing you in a way to affirm what was done to you.
Yeah, the medical system is very unwilling to acknowledge this as a negative thing in any way. Somewhat recently, I got access to my medical records from the Children's Hospital that put me on testosterone. And they, at every appointment, gave me this mental health checklist where my mental health was scored out of 100, 100 being the worst. And these scores at every appointment consistently got worse. My mental health was consistently declining. And that was never addressed. I didn't know that until I looked at the records years later. Yeah. No one was like, hey, so maybe this isn't actually helping.
Well, especially at that age with those medical records, I look at them all day. A 14-year-old's not going to pick that up and understand it, but like you said, you went back and you found you got your records. Were they withholding of those records? Were they trying to keep those from you, or would you say the process of getting them was pretty easy?
The actual appointment notes were pretty easy to get, but things like so I had to go to an appointment that was like a 2-hour-long assessment with a psychologist at the hospital. Yeah. This was not easy to get. I had to send a lot of emails, make phone calls. They are required to give it to me, so yes. There's no reason that should have been the case, but they really did not want me to see this assessment for some reason. Well, I know the reason. It's because they lied.
Yeah. It's a very prevalent thing. And if you really think about it, and for people who are watching right now who aren't in the space that Simon and Claire are, or are educated, or even, the position I'm in where I kind of, this is what I do, this is my job. How are we supposed to know what the providers are actually doing? If they put down that you're going, and this is just surface level, basic, let's say you're going into a doctor's appointment and they're billing for an hour and you only went for 30 minutes. How are they going to know? They're not going to know because, again, we're just sitting at our desks and we're, putting your claim through, or, somebody's looking at it and they're just, approve, deny, by the rules and regulations that the insurance companies have to follow in the contracts that the insurance companies have with these doctors. Would you maybe say, and this is, my personal opinion here, I try to stay neutral on the health insurance issue sometimes, but I think maybe better auditing of these providers, not only by the health insurance companies themselves, is having a duty to their customers to make sure that the doctors that they're seeing in the network of the insurance company are being held accountable, but also on the government level. Would you say more regulation in the auditing and, making sure that they're not altering your documents, because, you may get the documents and they may have done everything correctly on paper, but in actuality they may have, altered that text or documentation.
Yeah, I think we need litigation. Number one, I think we need to put some people in prison so that people are afraid to do this, and we make
Yep.
it very clear to people that this is America. We have laws, and we enforce the laws. And when you break a law, we will find you and we will put you in prison.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's insane. These providers are getting away with it, hand over fist.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's
We recently
unacceptable.
found out from, I think Ethan Heim has done some work on this recently, if I recall correctly, where our previous counts of the numbers of medicalized children were like what like an order of magnitude at least an undercount, because we
Yes.
were unable to count all of the kids who were diagnosed with endocrine disorder not otherwise specified as a way to fraudulently prescribe them cross-sex hormones.
Yeah.
So the report,
I know exactly what you're talking
you'll-
about.
What you'll see when you look it up is that, like, 1% of our generation identifies as trans, and around 1% of that number is medicalized. But what Simon's talking about is a study from a rural Idaho hospital that saw that around was it 7%
7%.
of 7% of the kids at this hospital, is a children's hospital, had trans identities, and around half of those kids were on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, and that 99% of those medicalized children were diagnosed with endocrine disorders, either in combination or exclusively, in combination with gender dysphoria or exclusively.
Yeah, those not otherwise specified is known in the medical coding world and the processing world as knock codes, where you're right, they keep things very specific. One of the popular ones that I see day to day is J3 409, which is a like you said, a drug knock code. So they'll put that down as a like a blank code. So when they're billing it to the insurance company, they have to physically give the description of the drug that they're submitting for. So yeah, I don't specifically know how they're using that in the fraudulent case. Again, I deal with the coding and processing, and that's kind of like my specialty when it comes to it. That's kind of all I have to provide for the table, is I'm very nerdy when it comes to the coding side of things. But so you're telling me basically they're using those not otherwise specified codes to, how are they using that to kind of avoid, like, what are they avoiding and hiding with that?
So the case against Mei Lau, the pediatrician that transitioned me, the allegation is that after the ban in 2023 in Texas on medicalizing children, she continued prescribing these medications by diagnosing them with endocrine disorders to falsely bill it as like a medically necessary treatment.
Oh, that's
To cover her
interesting.
tracks.
Yeah, that's classic sneaky right there. Yeah, that's insane. So what did they kind of just had to go and take those? So they were basically false diagnosing you on paper with something, and one of the harmful effects of that, which I'm just putting the connection into my head, is let's say they put that down, and let's say you have a heart attack. Let's say you get hit by a car, and you need to go to a hospital, and they pull your medical records, and they're seeing that. That could potentially alter your care and what they're given to you. If you're allergic to like a penicillin, and they wanted to use that towards treatment, but you're not actually allergic to a penicillin, then that could affect how your life is being saved. I know that's a very surface level idea, but just to give the audience more perspective on that, I think that's a pretty basic, generalization of how something like that could actually affect people's lives. And, something like that may not be picked up right away or at all in some of these cases, because, if individuals are being falsely diagnosed, who knows how many people have actually been treated incorrectly or could have been treated quicker to, heal from whatever ailment they had.
It also destroys like the ability to have accurate statistics on endocrine disorders when so
And
many of these
trust.
children
Yeah.
are being falsely diagnosed with it.
If you look at the rates of endocrine disorders, there's been a hockey stick.
So they're just kind of using that as a general.
I think there are, of course,
Yeah.
environmental factors of like legitimate
Yeah.
endocrine disorders that are happening because of, processed foods and stuff. And also,
Yeah, no, this is very interesting. I personally, I knew they were doing stuff similar to that, but it seems like it's being done on a more larger scale than we actually expected.
yeah, way larger. Yeah.
So, for both of you, thank you for joining me. I know we just hit like around an hour. Do you want to shout out your social medias or groups you're working for or people? Please like link it up. I want people to interact and support you guys in your mission to helping people in this medical space and within the LGBT plus community.
So as I said, I'm an IWF ambassador. That's a great group to reach out and support. Also, LGB Courage, amazing groups. Support them. I'm Burn Your Binder on X and on YouTube,
And
Awesome.
TikTok.
and TikTok. So,
Gotta get TikTok right.
yeah, feel free to search me up on there.
Yeah.
Awesome.
In addition to the organizations that Claire shared, there's a lot of great local like family institutes and organizations. I also wanted to say Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender, amazing organization. They do a lot of great work, and I know a lot of people over there. I'm at this point not a Democrat myself. I used to be. But, if we're going to see change on this issue in Massachusetts, it's going to come from Democrats.
Yeah.
You can find me on YouTube, X, Instagram, and TikTok, but I don't post there anymore, so don't look at my TikTok. At Simon Amaya Price, that's at SIMONAMAYAPRICE.
Awesome. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you for watching the first official episode. I've actually rebranded my podcast for my political action committee that I run. We're now called the Coalition Cast. So thank you both for joining us, and we look forward to seeing the amazing things you guys do in the push to stop these abusive practices within our healthcare industry. So thank you for both joining me.
Thank you for having us.